It's not a dirty little secret. Pollution wreaks havoc on India, the world's most populous nation. Dubbed public enemy number one, pollution kills approximately 2 million annually in India. This photograph depicts deployment of an anti-smog gun, a desperate attempt to temporarily reduce the effects of this overwhelming negative externality in the capital city of Delhi. But India needs a more serious and permanent solution to address this crisis. Can a market-based cap-and-trade system reduce pollution in India? The remainder of this presentation examines the economic experiment launched in the western state of Gujarat and the pros and cons of a market-based approach to combating the negative externality of pollution. Information conveyed in this article was gathered primarily from the article in The Economist, Can Markets Reduce Pollution in India? The air pollution plaguing cities in India, dubbed a negative externality in production by economists, can be explained using market analysis. On the graph, the vertical axis labeled P measures the price of manufactured goods in urban settings. The vertical axis simultaneously measures all costs and benefits associated with these market transactions. The horizontal axis labeled Q measures the quantity of manufactured goods in urban settings, the quantity bought and sold. Identify the non-governmental private sector equilibrium outcome, where D, the downward sloping demand curve, intersects with S, the upward sloping supply curve. This is the market equilibrium, aka market equilibrium point, with QE level of output. Unfortunately, this is an inefficient allocation of resources, as the private sector is failing to pay the true cost of all market activities. The producers are passing on the externality of pollution to citizens living in and around these manufacturing facilities. How can the government correct for this misallocation of resources and eliminate what economists refer to as dead weight loss, or the inefficiency of the negative externality in production? In essence, the government needs to shift the supply curve from SMPC, or the marginal private cost, and force producers to pay the true cost of manufacturing, therefore shifting the supply curve to the marginal social cost, reallocating resources to achieve an allocatively efficient level of output, or the socially optimal level of output. Understand, there will still be some pollution associated with socially optimal. It will just be an acceptable level of pollution. The economist examines the old system of command and control versus the innovative cap and trade system to address the negative externality in production. And the economist points out that the previous command and control system regulations, which actually remain in place in most of India, the old system involved forcing plants to install pollution abatement equipment, which was periodically inspected by officials to determine if emissions fell below the acceptable limit. Unfortunately, with the old system, it proved highly ineffective, as 30% of firms breached their pollution threshold. Why? Well, monitoring was sporadic, enforcement weak, and regulatory agents found it difficult to carry out their mandated tasks, as they were severely understaffed. It was also difficult to track factories, especially smaller ones. Many firms struggled to meet the cost of required technology to limit emissions. So how can a market-based cap and trade system prove more effective as an alternative solution to address negative externalities in production? For the past 5 years, in the Indian western province of Gujarat, the cap and trade market-based approach to reduce pollution has been carried out by the GPCB, or Gujarat Pollution Control Board, in the city of Surat. The system is modeled after the emissions cap and trade system in the West used to address climate change. But instead of trading carbon, pollution permits are traded. Companies exceeding the threshold for particle matter emission must purchase permits from competitors who have not yet reached their limit. How does the cap and trade system work? The government creates the market for tradable pollution permits. The process begins with the regulatory commission, in this case, the Gujarat Pollution Control Board, identifying the socially optimal level of pollution and setting the cap at that level. There is some ambiguity or normative economics in identifying what is the socially optimal level of pollution, but assuming the government is able to identify this correctly, next the government issues permits to match the cap. On the graph, the vertical supply curve, perfectly price inelastic, is set to match the socially optimal level of pollution or cap. Demand is downward sloping, and that represents the demand for pollution rights, aka pollution permits. P on the graph represents the price of permits, also the price of pollution. Now, firms have a choice to make. Firms will adopt the least cost method based on their individual situation, and they will either A, invest in pollution reduction technology, or B, purchase spare permits in the market. Firms that invest in pollution reduction technology will have permits to sell, and obviously firms who forego this capital investment will be looking to purchase permits. In economic terms, the beauty of this approach is that either way, the externality will be internalized and pollution is paid for in the most efficient manner. Assuming enforcement is put in place, pollution will be reduced to the allocatively efficient or socially optimal level. Why? Because in the long run, firms will adopt pollution reduction technology. They will do so for one of two reasons. Either they will see the opportunity to profit in the market for pollution permits, or they will realize that by investing in pollution reducing technology, they will not be burdened by price increase in permits. Why will the price of permits increase? Because as time moves forward, the government will reduce the supply of pollution permits available, shifting the vertical supply curve leftward, increasing the price of pollution. Firms who have invested in pollution reduction technology will therefore avoid these increased costs. Economics is a social science. As such, nothing is perfect. What are the 4 issues or problems with the cap and trade or tradable pollution permit solution to addressing a negative externality in production? Let's discuss these 4 and then examine how they specifically relate to the situation in India. The first is enforcement. Can enforcement be afforded? This is generally a problem in developing countries. And is there technology available to measure emissions? The second issue is imperfect information ultimately affecting the government policies, implementation, and outcome. The government needs to identify the socially optimal level of pollution and set the cap accordingly. However, setting the cap too strict or being too lenient will ultimately lead to a failure of this system. Third, there may be unintended consequences, as increasing the cost of production by forcing this system onto firms could make them unprofitable, and therefore they could go out of business. No bueno for the economy. The last one is specific to the climate change issue, is that there's need for international cooperation for it to be ultimately effective. However, because we are evaluating just the situation in India about localized pollution, this fourth one does not apply to this specific scenario. Take a look at this beauty, the CEMS, or Continuous Emissions Monitoring System. Success of the cap and trade system depends on reliable data. Years before cap and trade market was introduced into Surat, regulators installed continuous emission monitoring system. These devices were placed in the ducts and chimneys, tracking emissions concentrations in real time. Now national regulators require high polluting firms to install similar systems. The sensors have improved data and address the weakness of the previous system, greatly improving the monitoring of emissions and virtually eliminating the first issue of enforcement. What is the verdict of the tradable pollution permits system introduced in India in regards to the other issues? A new study by Nicholas Ryan of Yale University and his collaborators suggests the Indian strategy is working. Participating plants have emitted 20 to 30% less pollution than non-participating competitors, and the program is proving wildly popular as it gives firms clarity and flexibility. The market is proving more efficient. Bigger firms find it cheaper to buy permits than invest in reducing emissions, and researchers estimate the decrease in pollution yielded longevity benefits worth at least 25 times the costs. The findings especially encouraging for policymakers grappling with India's fundamental economic dilemma: more factories for economic growth and job creation versus less pollution. Can Surat's success be replicated? Hundreds of industrialized centers across India already make it a wide market for the cap and trade system to succeed. Unlike carbon trading, there's no need for international cooperation, as mentioned before, and there's been pollution markets launched this year in Ahmedabad. Regulators are actually working to introduce a cap and trade market for sulfur in the city of Maharashtra. Setting up markets and enforcing conditions requires more bureaucratic capacity and requires significant investment in legislation. Markets alone are insufficient to defeat pollution, as industrial emissions account for only 30% of the total pollution problem. But for Indian taxpayers, the marginal benefits of the cap and trade system far outweigh the marginal costs.